Tell us about your assessment of the real situation there.
Okay, these are very long-standing problems. They're not new. So, in effect, the current government has inherited them. And it's very complicated because it involves several states. So, we're talking about Shan State, we're talking about Wa State, we're talking about Rakhine. And within each of these conflicts, there are several groups. For example, the group that we are focusing right now in this show, it actually consists of the Ta'ans, the Kachins, the MNDAA, and other splinter groups. So you can see that it's a kind of a layered, complex problem, and it also involves religion, as you have mentioned, amongst the Rohingyas that are fleeing towards Bangladesh. One of the reasons why they are fleeing is because some of the government forces suspect that there are operatives within the community that they want to seek out. So this very complicated, very complex issue, and I think it will probably take a long time to resolve, and time is probably needed even for de-escalation.
Right. It might be a long time because these are questions being formed over a long period of time. But Mr. Yang in Beijing, that is happening on China's border.
Yep.
Between China and Myanmar, 3,000 people already come into China.
Yeah.
In the Wanding specific county in China's Yunnan province. That's going to be a big problem for China. It's also going to be a big problem for Bangladesh. Bangladesh already summoned in some of the diplomats from Myanmar to talk about that issue. They don't want these people to be in their country either. They want to repatriate these people. Yeah. So what does it mean for for Myanmar's neighbors, such as China?
Well, for China, not only the issue of the refugee, 3,000 maybe more sometime later, and also a problem of the dangerous risks for Chinese nationals in the neighboring area. There have been some Chinese nationals with harm. So loss of lives and loss of assets. So it's a really serious problem, challenge to China. So first of all, China has to insist on the principle of non-intervention about Myanmar's internal affairs. But on the other hand, China will be very, very firm and take a very tough action to guarantee our own national security and our national interests.
Okay, let me go to you once again, Mr. Lim. What to do, first of all, about the security of the border? It has so much to do with these people who are 1 million big, which is a very small minority inside Myanmar. They're called the Rohingya. They are never being regarded as Myanmese. They are not citizens, even though they settle in that country for generations. Their homes and schools are being regarded as illegal structures, so might be torn down. These people organize themselves and fight against the government forces. The 9 police officers were killed by some of those from this group, and therefore the government forces pushed back. That's what we are seeing right now. The question is, what is the way to solve this problem, Mr. Lim?
Well, one of the proposal that has been put forward is, and that is a proposal that's favored by the NLD party that is in power right now, is for a federal state. But this is further complicated by the fact that there are so many stakeholders involved. The military is involved. And also, as I mentioned, there are so many ethnic and religious groups that are involved. So in order to form a rainbow coalition or consensus across, a broad consensus across all these groups will take a lot of political will and also compromise. And therefore, time again is very much needed. Plus, the Myanmarese political system, you have about 25% of the parliament that is within the military's control. And so there's also a very acute need for political consensus even within the government and the political process. And here's where China has publicly mentioned that it's willing to help out with the reconciliation process. But as the other guest, Mr. Yang, has mentioned, it cannot be seen as an interference in the internal affairs of Myanmar.
Right.
So it also has to have some kind of indication from the Myanmarese government, or at least some form of invitation to help out with this issue, and probably other international stakeholders as well.
There are other international stakeholders who have been vowing to help also with the national reconciliation process in Myanmar, particularly when Ms. Suu Kyi came into office earlier. And yet we see the rhetorics have been changing, particularly from the Western countries and even from some of the international media outlets. More accusations rather than now more talk about solutions. Mr. Yang, what do you make of this change of attitudes coming from some of the important stakeholders, particularly, just say, if I could use the word, the West?
Yeah.
And what does it mean for Ms. Suu Kyi and her government, which needs consensus, as Mr. Lim mentioned, to go ahead to approach a new solution?
Well, first of all, the change of the attitude from the West is based on the change of value of the politics in Myanmar. Say they highly appreciate Suu Kyi's value and political institutions, so they change their attitudes. But the problem is the reality remain unchanged. The conflicts, the contradictions, the inequalities among the ethnic groups, everything remain unchanged. So I'm afraid at this moment, the West appreciate Suu Kyi's regime and appreciate Suu Kyi's efforts. But if Suu Kyi take actions to address the real problems beyond the value framework, I'm afraid that the honeymoon between Suu Kyi's government and the West will be terminated.
Well, we all understand very well that State Councillor Aung San Suu Kyi from Myanmar has been making the simmering unrest in Myanmar's border region as a governmental priority since she took office. And yet, there are a lot of realities. Clashes of this sort continue. As we mentioned, in September, fights broke out between the military and rebels in the southern Shan State and the northern half of Rakhine State, and it's currently under a military lockdown after a string of deadly attacks on border posts last month. So to the police officers over there, the latest clashes in Shan State are yet another blow to Suu Kyi's hopes of forging a nationwide peace agreement. Mr. Lim, that question is ever approaching to Ms. Suu Kyi. That is, how will she face the realities? Will she also incorporate some of the measures that she accused the earlier administration of doing in terms of handling the current crisis? That would, of course, be a question mark. And secondly, how would she answer the so-called accusations or questions coming from some members of the international community? Mr. Lim.
She has a very difficult job, and she's trying to manage the job. It's a very complex problem because these problems have been around even before she took power. So it is not realistic for us or for anyone to expect Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi to completely resolve them within a very short time. Having said that, her government was making some headways in the peace process in the Wa state before the current round of conflict. So if she's able to persist with some of these peacemaking gestures, and more importantly, if she's able to strike a consensus with the other political factions within her government and also within the political environment of Myanmar's political scene, then there might be a possibility for the peace process to go forward.
Right.
And it has to occur in stages. There has to be first de-escalation, and after de-escalation, a ice-breaking session before they can actually talk about the main terms of a peace process.
Right.
And these require a lot of time, a lot of political will, and a lot of political consensus. And the international community, including China, can come in and help out with the process as well as Myanmar's ASEAN counterparts.
Right. At this moment, Mr. Yang, we understand there were earlier a peace talk, if we could use that phrase, between the government and also some of the minorities of the country. 17 out of the 20 already participated in the meeting, and yet some have not. And those some have recently been heating up their campaigns against the government forces. But even about that peace talk, it is in the nature of these minority groups trying to seek more autonomy with political consent from the government. And yet, as you may know, a country could only give certain degrees of autonomy to the minority groups of a country. So this is a very interesting tug of war, if we could use that phrase once again, between the government and these minority groups. Mr. Yang.
Well, I think the situation and the issue of Myanmar that you mentioned that we're discussing are very unique. In total, there are 135 ethnic groups, and only one of the 100 plus occupy over 60% of the population. So in fact, the equality issue has been a decades-long problem for this country. So basically, I think the failure of the previous peace talks lies in the lack of the full equalities among all the groups. So for solving this problem or contradiction or dilemma, I think the authority who commands the advantages over all the parties or groups should lower further the threshold, should give a greater common grounds, should make a greater compromise so that the process can be more inclusive, including all the groups.
Mr. Lim, is that possible? I mean, you can see, while Mr. Yang explained the realities on the ground in Myanmar, that is the differences of the level of expectations among different groups and between these groups and also the government. That is very hard to readjust the expectations, as you may know, Mr. Lim.
There are long-standing political problems, but at the core of the political problems, there are also economic ones. And what are the economic issues that involve? The economic issues that involve include apportionment of resources, who owns which part of the forest, who owns which part of the gemstone mines, how do they equitably distribute the wealth from the natural resources, and also apportionment of territorial boundaries. All these are very real economic problems, and it may be possible to focus on economic problems first, resolve some of the bread and butter issues on resource allocation, and also economic development. Again, that's where the international community can come in, whether it's the World Bank or the One Belt One Road from China, or the AIIB from China, or the ASEAN cooperative partners. They can come in to help with economic development part of the issue. So if they can start off with the resource issue, the apportionment of natural resources, and also economic development, perhaps there can be a functional solution that can be sort of the early stages in an early solution to the more complex political issues.
And Mr. Lim, just one correction, AIIB is not China's, but rather an organization that incorporates many founding members, their consensus. But by the way, let me come back to you, Mr. Yang. Will Mr. Lim's suggestion about these different kinds of organization mechanism coming together, how much will that really address the root problems? After all, it is still Myanmar's own issue. They have to come up with their own consensus. Is political, economic issues chicken and egg thing? Are we seeing a ever worse cycle of this?
Yeah, I really agree with Mr. Lin's idea. Actually, you're right. Say all the mixed groups sitting the table plus some outsiders have a question of chicken and eggs. Who should go first? But the difficult answer lies in the economic cooperation, economic development. Now, by facing so many dilemmas, the common exit lies in the economical one. So we should focus on the economic cooperation, meanwhile continue to address the political differences so that we can have a solution.
Before we go, final words from both of you, very briefly if you can. We see the root cause, we see the political crisis, and we also see an immediate border crisis going on right now. What to do? Very briefly sum up, Mr. Lim, one sentence.
Okay, three things very important. Number one, pragmatism. Go for economic development and cooperation. Number two, have a very broad consensus amongst the political faction. And number three, compromises.
I see. Mr. Yang.
For China, first of all, ceasefire unconditionally right now. Secondly, quick arrangement for the refugees and measures preventing more refugees flooding in both Bangladesh and China.